For those of you, in case you're wondering if you're in the right room, you are.
Yeah.
This is called Beyond MDMA, Funding Future Transformative Medicines. And I am sitting with Divya Chander, Dr. MD, PhD, and Ani Chahal-Honan, and Adrian Joe, and they will all get a chance to introduce themselves. But first, let's talk about me. Oh, you want to talk about you? What do you think about me? My name's Julie Holland. I am a psychiatrist wishing that I put the microphone on my right lapel. And I'm an author. In 2001, I came out with a book called Ecstasy, The Complete Guide, which was a book that I edited. I wrote a great deal of it, but I did not write all of it. And back in the 80s and 90s, anyone who was involved with MDMA has got a chapter in that book. I am a practicing psychiatrist, psychopharmacologist, and I am a medical advisor to a lot of psychedelic companies. And just in terms of disclosure, I'm a medical advisor to MAPS and a VC company called Palo Santo, and another VC company for cannabis called CB1, and a company called Entactogen, where I am a scientific advisor. I'm also a medical advisor for Beckley Foundation and Paul Stamets's mushroom company. And there's a very long list. If anyone's worried about my disclosures or my integrity, I am so happy to talk to you after this panel. I would like everybody to not only introduce yourself, so we get a better sense of you, but I have this idea of like an origin story that probably something happened in your past that brought you to the space. So a quick origin story, haiku form is acceptable, and now where are you now? So that maybe we get a little bit of an arc. And we'll just go this way.
Hey everyone, I'm Adrian. So I'm a fellow at Palo Santo as well as a neuropharmacology PhD candidate at Penn studying opioid dependence. So Palo Santo, we're an early stage $50 million VC fund exploring therapeutics focused on novel mechanisms of action for mental health, many of which fall under the categories of psychedelics, entactogens, and dissociatives. In terms of what got me interested in psychedelics, it's really all stemmed from my sheer utter fascination in neuroscience, which truthfully stems from a place of frustration growing up at the way mental health disorders have been stigmatized relative to many other peripherally restricted health challenges, and the way substance use disorders were portrayed to me, especially by the officers from the DARE program, as self-inflicted moral failings, as opposed to the complex reality that addiction is a brain disease where the brain is hijacked by functional circuits that dysregulate functions in reward, stress, despair, compulsions, and that researchers all over the world are dedicating their lives to further understanding these pathologies, one of which is Roland Griffith's 2014 Journal of Psychopharmacology paper, Psilocybin on Smoking Cessation, which instilled in me a sense of hope. Wait, what is our current standard of care for these indications? Does hope reside potentially in these compounds? And so I think in terms of thinking about novel standards of care for a number of these indications, psychedelics, what I hope is that scientifically rigorous innovations that can bridge the gap between commercially viable solutions and neuroscience is absolutely my aspiration here.
So hi, everybody. I am the second neuroscientist on the panel, so we're very neuroscience heavy. I'm also an anesthesiologist, so kind of a drug pusher for a living. I was about 6 or 7 years old when I decided I wanted to fly in space and experience what it was like to be connected to the universe. So I've always been in this sort of exploration mode. I built models of the brain out of popsicle sticks when I was a kid, and somehow found my way through both space medicine and a PhD in neuroscience. And then when I had to pick my MD field, I decided to pick anesthesiology because I wanted to study the problem of consciousness. And in this discipline, I could make people unconscious for a living and then study their brains. And so that's what I chose to do. And recently, what I have been doing is actually mapping the process of consciousness in my patients in the operating room. So I put electrodes on their forehead, and I actually watch them move from being awake and aware to sort of moving into this incredibly crazy space where they lose touch with the outer world. And then they come back, and then I map their brains in the process. And the things that I learned there, I have been wanting now to compare to data sets in psychedelics, because my prediction, and we can talk more about consciousness later, but my prediction is we're going to continue to see things almost on the exact opposite end of the spectrum. So whereas I remove consciousness in the operating room, we'll see expansions.
You know, I went to space camp, Divya. So I so get that. What was that?
Oh,
You know,
yeah.
We're definitely going to leave time at the end for Q&A, as you may imagine.
Absolutely.
So, this is actually
Voluntary.
not an interactive session yet, but I
it will
love
be.
Q&A. So,
But it
and
will be.
I also identify as somebody with impulse control issues, but I'm going to ask us all to do that, you know, frontal cortex inhibition thing. But we absolutely want to do Q&A at the end. It's my favorite part of a panel. Do you want to intro yourself more?
I will. I don't have haiku, but I'll go quickly. I worked on that though, Julie, and yeah. So I'm Annie Chahal Honan. It's crazy that I'm saying this. I'm a VC, but I've spent most of my life as a creator, and I still kind of stand in that really big, honorable place, because if anyone's a creator in any capacity, it's one of the hardest things in the world to do, but also rewarding. And I have worked, the way my weird monkey brain works is I have had the honor of working with a lot of pioneers in technology and innovation, including life sciences. And how I entered into this amazing, wonderful world is that this is very deeply personal for me and my family. My husband is here, and we've actually, between us, I think we have multi-generational addiction across multiple sides of our families, and we've been down that journey. If anyone has been through it, it's tough, as well as what we call MDD, which is a form of depression that has, I think, a lot of people in different families experience. I like to call it treatment-resistant depression. And my mom was recently diagnosed with stage 6 of Alzheimer's. So we kind of have a nice umbrella of mental health really challenges in our family, and have walked that journey. And so I am committed to raise $100 million just for mental health innovation. I am founder of two things. One is Unity, and we are committed to creating an ecosystem for creating better companies and helping creators create mindful, better companies aligned to triple bottom line, people, planet, profit. And our new brand, Imagine, is where we're going very, very deep around mental health fitness.
I love it. I appreciate everybody introing themselves. You know, the haiku idea is that if you can take a complex topic and really think about it for a long time, you get some sort of distillation. You force yourself into a distillation where you've got, like sometimes I'll introduce myself and I will say, what do I say? Harm reductionist, psychopharmacologist, author, musician, or sometimes I'll say author, advisor, or I'll say stoner and something else. I use cannabis. I believe that cannabis is a psychedelic. The definition of psychedelic is mind manifesting, and one of the things that unites most psychedelics is that it will tickle the 5-HT2A receptor, the serotonin 2A receptor, and high-dose THC will also do that. So we're going to talk specifically about one psychedelic today, or one group of psychedelics, I should say. So the classical psychedelics you may know, like LSD and mushrooms and DMT and things of this nature, they work sort of in one way that one of the things they do is reliably tickle the serotonin 2A receptor. But entactogens are a whole other class of medicines or molecules, and MDMA is sort of the prototype for that class. And MDMA doesn't just tickle that 2A receptor, although it does a lot of other things. And just very, very briefly, and in the most simplistic way, and I'm happy to go into more detail later, but the way you could sort of conceptualize it is that It sort of increases, and I'm using air quotes here if you're listening at home, serotonin, dopamine, norepinephrine. These are three neurotransmitters or neurochemicals that are all in one family, which are called monoamines. So increases all of that and massively increases serotonin. But the other thing it does is increase oxytocin. And you may have heard of oxytocin. It is the neurohormone and a neurotransmitter. So it's a hormone throughout the body and also a neurotransmitter. Tends to work better in an estrogen-rich environment. Take that as you will. AFAB panel. Oxytocin underlies social bonding and trust and connection, and you can see it in a nursing mother with an infant or any parent with an infant. It's a high oxytocin situation where you've got eye contact and you feel connected to somebody. It can also happen when you're tripping balls, as one might say, whether or not you actually have testicles. When you're peaking on psychedelics, that also can be a high oxytocin state, but it doesn't compare to the high oxytocin state of MDMA. And I think that is part of how it sort of works its charm. But what we're going to talk about is not just MDMA, methylene dioxymethamphetamine, which hopefully will soon be FDA approved in August. We're going to also talk about the Me Too drugs, the MDMA adjacent drugs, or just the larger group of entactogens. There are several companies that are working to create MDMA-like molecules with all sorts of benefits or potentially drawbacks. So that's what we're going to focus on most. And I will open up by asking you, Adrian, a question. Also a University of Pennsylvania alumnus. Just got to say hoorah for any pen heads in the audience. Adrian, what promising new entactogen and psychedelic-inspired compounds are in early research and development right now?
Yeah, so there are a number of really cool, exciting startups who are at the forefront of creating novel psychedelic and entactogen-like analogs. And so by analogs, we're thinking about a compound whose molecular structure is very similar to that of their parent compound, but is tweaked in such a way that changes the chemical composition that may affect factors like the way a drug is absorbed or metabolized, its side effect profile, the psychological effects, the hallucinations. And so starting off with entactogen. So entactogen is at the forefront of creating novel MDMA-like analogs that are based from the benzofuran scaffold. So think of a scaffold as like the chemical backbone of a molecule. It's like the thing that holds everything in place. And so in entactogen's case, by replacing one of the oxygens with a carbon, they aim to retain the therapeutic psychological effects of MDMA, however, overcome the limitations of MDMA, such as feelings of hypertension, anxiety, feelings of sedation, impairments, and also by influencing and changing this core structure, improving the metabolic stability while simultaneously reducing the production of toxic metabolites that may contribute to some of these side effects. In addition to entactogen, we also have Delix. So Delix is creating novel, non-hallucinogenic neuroplastogens, some call them psychoplastogens. So the aim here is to mimic the clinical efficacy of rapid and durable changes in structural and functional neuroplasticity, all while stripping away the hallucinations. And so some compounds in their pipeline, we have DLX001, which is a non-hallucinogenic, non-dissociative isotryptamine, currently in phase 1 for major depressive disorder. We also have DLX007, which is a novel analog of ibogaine. You may have heard of ibogaine being quite efficacious in some cultures for opioid use disorder. Within that line, this non-hallucinogenic, non-cardiotoxic analog is being investigated for stimulant use disorders, opioid use disorders, and is entering clinic this year. We also have Gilgamesh. They have a number of compounds in their pipeline, starting off with an NMDAR antagonist. So the NMDA receptor is the key target for the glutamate neurotransmitter. So the key excitatory neurotransmitter in the brain, that's glutamate for you. So you take NMDA antagonists like ketamine. And PCP, exactly, thank you. And you take these drugs and they block and inhibit this key excitatory neurotransmission in the brain. So Gilgamesh is aiming to improve the oral bioavailability of compounds like ketamine. Oral bioavailability, what does that even mean? So when you take a drug by mouth, it is the proportion of the drug that remains in active composition to enter systemic circulation, go through your bloodstreams to enter the target tissue up in your brain. factors that can impede the oral bioavailability of a drug is like when a drug gets degraded and digested by the various juices in your stomach and your intestines. Gilgamesh is also targeting drugs that act on the 5-HT2A receptor, key receptor subtype that is thought to mediate the hallucinations of many psychedelic trips when these compounds activate and agonize the 2A receptor. We also have companies like Beckley. They currently are creating a novel intranasal formulation of 5-MeO-DMT, currently in phase 2 for treatment-resistant depression. And I will conclude with Transcend Therapeutics. They are creating a novel MDMA analog using methylone. So methylone is thought to be shorter acting as well as milder in its psychoactive effects relative to MDMA. Currently being investigated for 2 indications, phase 2 for PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder, phase 1 for major depressive disorder. So as we can see, there are a number of really cool, exciting startups that are targeting a number of drug classes, mechanisms of action, and standards of care and indications that could potentially just provide more optionality with the hope and dream of improving compound safety, efficacy, and of course, patient accessibility.
Wow. Was that a lot? That was a lot. So I speak Adrian. So a couple things. So there's tons of companies out there, like big picture. There's a lot of companies out there who are looking for IP. You have plant compounds like ibogaine that Adrian was mentioning, which is originally sort of used in sacred rituals, let's just say sacred rituals by the Bwiti tribe in Gabon in Africa. Not necessarily for medical use in Gabon, but what turned out is that some people who were initiated or went to be initiated in the Bwiti tribe and had the ibogaine experience no longer were using opiates. And Howard Lotsoff is really kind of the OG ibogaine guy. I was really fortunate to go to a very early ibogaine conference in the 90s that NYU sponsored, God bless them. And the big issue with ibogaine is that it's cardiotoxic in certain people in certain situations. You really need to have a cardiac screening before you have the medicine. But the people who undergo ibogaine, and it is a very long-acting psychedelic, 2 to 3 days, 36 hours, 30 hours, like very long-acting. What is a plasticogen? I'm glad you asked. It's a terribly named group of molecules that induces neuroplasticity. I'm going to use air quotes a lot now. Neuroplasticity is about rewiring the circuitry and sort of rejiggering the space, and neurons that fire together wire together, and if you do certain things while you're in this plastic state, it may help to sort of change your neural circuitry. I'm using air quotes again. So ibogaine is profoundly neuroplastic and has the longest open window of neuroplasticity once it is induced. People are microdosing ibogaine now, I hear, which is a very interesting idea. So the cardiac toxicity is real, and there are several companies looking to modify it so it's not toxic. And then the one more thing I will say is this idea of whether something is a hallucinogen or not. I don't like the word hallucinogen because sometimes if you're taking a psychedelic and you have this sense that there's a lot more to the world than you've seen, and that the screens are down and a lot more information is coming in, and maybe it's just all about love and connection and giving to other people, and maybe the universe is big and we're small, but we're all connected. That's not a hallucination. Like, that's the reality. So I don't like to call these things hallucinogens. And there's no way I will let you call MDMA a hallucinogen because it really does not induce auditory or visual hallucinations. There may be a little bit of visual illusion, and part of that is that your pupils are open and lights look nice and warm and glowy. But Delix and other companies are trying to create compounds that are non-hallucinogenic and are plasticogens, all terrible wording, but the idea, and it's a good idea, is that not everybody wants a trip to benefit from psychedelics. Psychedelics are anti-inflammatory, and inflammation is the key to almost every ailment you can think of. They are immune modulators, and again, your immune system is the basis of almost any diagnosis you can think of. So these are really powerful medicines, and some of them make you think that your life has a meaning, or that you can have hope in the world, or that love is the answer and should be your sort of guiding principle. And again, not hallucinations. So this question of whether you can have the neuroplasticity without the hallucination is a very fundamental issue. And our field. And I'm going to go to my next question. Don't worry, you guys, there's enough time for everything.
No, I actually just wanted to say something also about, just to put it in the smallest possible context. If these medicines have very severe side effects, how many people are going to want to use them? And how are our regulatory bodies going to allow people to use them at home? We have a whole world of people stuck on SSRIs and all kinds of other, they all have side effects, right? So this whole thing that the two of them are talking about, by modifying them so that they're easier to take, have fewer side effects, it democratizes access to things where people might have otherwise been fearful or are just not able to do on their own. Many of us advocate for doing this in a therapeutic setting, and if any of you have ever done a psychedelic, the one-on-one therapy also takes a very long time. It's a big commitment, you and that therapist. What if companies, and entactogen's one of them, there are many of them in this space, that was amazing. What if they gave you the ability to take this home with you and do it on your own and feel safe? And that access, I think, is really important. So.
Yeah, and building off of that, I think especially the cardiotoxicity risk, for me, that's probably one of the factors I'm most excited about.
Heart racing, your blood pressure going up, all those scary things.
Exactly, because as we're still figuring out, number one, which indications compound X is efficacious for, what if there's an expansion beyond other indications? Like, for instance, the dosing frequency for major depressive disorder could very well be different than the frequency for a substance use disorder when we're thinking about the relapse rates, et cetera. That could be different indication to indication. So if frequencies are more frequent for one indication, you would want to take into account the cardiovascular risks for more frequent dosing as opposed to if it's more kind of spaced out.
I want to say something about MDMA's cardiac risk, because I think that they're not excessive, and I think that FDA is not going to insist on things like cardiac workup ahead of time, which with Ibogaine you absolutely have to. People sometimes have small bumps in their blood pressure or their heart rate, and mostly we compare it to what you would see in moderate exercise, or, and this is very important, getting moderately upset about something. And this is especially true for people who are, AFAB people. I'm not going to say women. I just said it. For whatever reason, and I would say if you have a home blood pressure monitor, check it the next time you and your spouse have a fight and see what your blood pressure looks like and see what your heart rate looks like, and then compare that to an MDMA experience, and you're putting your heart, if you want to say, at risk. But so yes, you're processing a lot of emotional things, and it's got a methamphetamine. Don't forget, it's methylene dioxymethamphetamine, right? Methamphetamine, as we all know, is speed, and sometimes a prescription ADD medicine. Plain old amphetamine and all its little tweakings is, Adderall and Vyvanse, which lots of people are taking. There's no reason to think that these things are particularly cardiotoxic or neurotoxic when they are used the way that, when this is an FDA-approved medicine, first of all, it is the first medicine that is going to be bundled or packaged with psychotherapy. Unlike other psychedelics, MDMA is really about a catalyst to make the psychotherapy and talk therapy go deeper, be more efficient, more effective. Anybody here who's gone through therapy knows that it really takes years, and peeling an onion and fits and starts. It's hard to get down to the places where you really got hurt, to examine them and figure out how they affected your behavior. So MDMA, because one of the things that oxytocin does is it really quiets the amygdala, which is the fear response. So you are really less defended. I will say, as a psychiatrist, I honestly could not create a molecule, and this is actually important for this panel. I don't know that I could make anything better than MDMA, because it really is uniquely suited to accompany in-depth psychotherapy and trauma processing for all kinds of pharmacological and neurological reasons, which I think I elucidated well enough. Divya, I want you to talk a little bit, because I know it's important. I said we were going to end with it, but I can't sort of stop, about just because of the plasticity, because of the vulnerability. People are in a highly suggestive state. With any psychedelic, you're in a very highly suggestive state. And I will give the terrible example, which is given often, of LSD and the Manson family. So you can be maybe convinced of things that might go against your nature. There is a significant vulnerability if you are going to, air quotes, rewire the circuitry. What are you plugging in there instead? What's your new code that you're putting in? And I really want, Divya, I want you to address the whole issue of what is being called neural rights.
Yeah, so I'll frame that in the let me give you maybe another way to think about this. So if your brain, all the circuits in it are a black box, and let's say you are someone with PTSD to begin with, the reason these therapies are so effective is that what's happened is your brain has formed a habit. That's what PTSD, it's a habit. You hear loud sound, and it produces this fear-anxiety response. In the process of using many of these, they don't all do exactly the same thing, but they tend to break apart the normal connections between circuits, and it's not necessarily permanent, but that's the state in which you can now take that same input, which maybe it's a loud sound, maybe it's a smell, maybe it's anything, maybe it's your spouse or loved one, and that input can now, it's like there's a moment where you can actually change what the output is going to become. And so basically what you're doing is all the diligence that normally it would take you to break a habit has been done by the medicine almost instantaneously. And so what that also means is that the brain is in a very suggestible state. So whatever you present to the brain in that moment, you can change what the meaning of that output is. And once you're done changing that meaning, as she mentioned, neurons that fire together, wire together, you have actually, they potentially changed that circuitry in a way that is remembered by the brain. The reason that this is also deeply important is anybody on this stage will tell you, anybody out here who works with medicine, technology, everything is dual use. I am also a neurotechnologist. I build things in the brain-computer interface world. There is nothing I do that doesn't have a possible other implication. We relieve suffering, and these things can be misused. And so I have been on a 5-6 year journey to talk to people about neural sovereignty and neural rights. Basically, how do we protect people from the unwanted reading of their brain and the unwanted writing to their brain? And there is a lot of, everybody's heard of Elon Musk's Neuralink. They are not the first people to use brain-machine interfaces, which are literally, they're invasive, so you have to crack open a skull to get these devices onto the brain. These have done so much for people with depression, paralysis, OCD, you name it, but you can rewrite the underlying circuits. We can do it non-invasively. We can deliver energy to the skull using things like ultrasound, so sound waves. We can use electricity. We can use magnetism. But once you do that, you have the possibility of changing what is underneath. I mean, if you can undo depression, you could create depression. You can also change the meanings of things. And with psychedelics, this is a form of non-invasive neuromodulation. And if you have somebody who is in a state like this, you can manipulate. And by the way, governments around the world, militaries around the world, starting actually very early, even the Nazis tried. They worked more with amphetamines to try and keep their soldiers awake and functional. But the CIA had an entire program for over 30 years to see if they could use, they mostly worked with LSD, but to work with LSD, MDMA, psilocybin, they tried them all. They had very variable effects, so they eventually let that program go. But it's very important to know that, by the way, the military is all over neurotechnology. They are one of the first adopters, and they often try to push the boundaries, even of paranormal psychology. You think that this stuff is not accepted out there, but the military is very interested. I say this all not to trash any particular group, but just to know that I think about these medicines also in the context that the people who are taking them need to be protected. If you have ever met somebody who's on MDMA, they just want to tell you all about their life. They open their hearts to you. And in that moment, there are things that can be done to manipulate them. So I've worked with the United Nations. I have worked with the Australian Human Rights Commission. I've worked with other governments. Fun fact, you can look this up. Chile is the first government in the world that has a neural bill of rights. A neural bill of rights. And that's because the former president of the Senate there is friends with a neuroscientist who told him all about this stuff. And he was like, wow, need to do something. So just putting all of this in that context doesn't take away the beautiful effects of these medicines. But
I'm really glad we talked about that. And the other thing I just want to briefly touch on is, as much as we're going to talk about trauma processing and psychiatric indications for these entactogens, and there are innumerable, because anything that can be ameliorated even a little bit by psychotherapy will be ameliorated more by MDMA-assisted psychotherapy, but also traumatic brain injury, stroke. You're going to be hearing a lot more about, if we're going to be helping to sort of create new patterns and new circuitry, it's going to be particularly helpful for people with stroke and traumatic brain injuries. And this, again, is the issue why some of these medicines, if you're really going to take it every day like a medicine, you may not want to be altered. We can understand, there's a huge sort of argument in the psychedelic community, but you have to have the trip because that's the meaning, and that may be true for all the psychological reasons. But if you're somebody who's had a stroke and you're using this for, neuroplasticity reasons, then you don't want to be altered. The stroke has altered you enough. And
by the way, many of these medicines actually, if you look at them, they actually give birth to new neurons, or those neurons actually, when I say make new connections, I don't mean that they just kind of switch who they're speaking to on the phone. I mean that they actually grow new places that other neurons can come and talk to them. And that's really very, very potent. The only other thing we know that does this right now is exercise. And this does it in an even more profound way. So giving birth to new nerve cells and to the connections between them is a very, very special property. So it actually, rather than hurting the brain, which is often what people's instinct is because they alter the way you feel, they actually usually are quite healing and they build up brains.
So, and some plasticogens, I can't say that without sneering. So what you're talking about, creating new neurons is neurogenesis. Or sometimes neuronogenesis, and then synaptogenesis is creating new connections, which is what we do when we come to South by. Ani, I'm sorry, I feel like you're just being neglected.
No,
but I'm actually going to give you two questions in a row to balance things out.
Oh my goodness.
Because I'm all about symmetry.
Let's go, Julie.
So first of all, what are your ideas about why pursue innovation beyond, these tried compounds like MDMA, where we already have a lot of data? What specific needs could the novel molecules address in terms of safety or efficacy or accessibility?
Well, first, I just want to break this down. I actually went to school and I studied chemical engineering, and I always try, and then I forgot almost everything because I entered the world of entrepreneurship and then investing. And so I always try and break this down and think about how I can talk with my friends and my family so that everyone understands. And I'm assuming there's a lot of brilliant people here, but when we decided to move into this space, I was really looking at just overall mental health. And I don't know if anyone's seen the studies by Harvard and Queensland University recently, because it started out when we were first researching, are we going to go in this space? We look at market. And we were seeing initially studies, 1 in 5 adults are suffering from mental health issues. And then 6 months later, 1 in 4 adults are suffering from mental health issues. And as of last year, the study is a study of 29 nations. They are now saying over 50% of adults will have a mental health disorder, 50% of the planet as adults. That's shocking. And this is happening very, very quickly. And and then there's other studies. There's a new phrase coming out that's called the friendship recession. Have you guys heard of this? The friendship recession is studies of adult men, single men and women. And we're now, and this is, 30 years ago, most men, the majority of men were saying, I love my friendship circle. There's 6 of us, and they're my bros, and they were very happy. And fast forward to now, 20% of adult single men do not have a single friend. 20%.
Right. So this is not a coincidence
This is
that
not.
the loneliness and the isolation leads to mental illness.
Exactly.
Shameless plug, my last book called Good Chemistry is all about connection and isolation. And it was written actually right before the epidemic. It came out, of course, 2020, right around the time of the epidemic. But I was writing about an epidemic, which was the loneliness epidemic, the isolation epidemic, deaths of despair. That has only gotten so much worse in the last 4 years. So it's not a coincidence that those numbers
and
correlate.
it's crazy because I think people who aren't in this field, when they hear these things, it's like, oh, I feel that way. And then 50% of those same men, of all men, are saying they're just not happy with their friendship circles because they're not tight. And so when we look at this industry as a whole, and we have kind of the early groups that have come in, and God bless them, done a lot of hard work to kind of bring psychedelics back into the world in a way that I think there's a big umbrella. There's a big umbrella when we look at use. I mean, I did start with plant medicine. We support indigenous communities around the world. But I kept thinking about certain friends and parents, and when I think about the different drugs and that evolution, my parents are never going to take plant medicine. I mean, I wish that they would, but they will not. But if their doctor prescribes something for them, they will. Like, they trust their doctor, and there are a lot of people like that. Mm-hmm. And so when we look at what are the incredible companies that are coming out now, and some of these startups, and oh my God, Adrienne, I mean, you explained just an incredible array of what's out there. That's where I get excited, because I think about how are you going to go to work and function, and if anyone's microdosed, I mean, that takes a little bit of time, and SSRIs too, by the way. That is a painful process for people. And so when I look at the current crop of just incredible startups, we've all been we're fans of entactogen. And I am not invested in entactogen, so I am just super impressed with the team there and what they're doing, because I always like to look at what's a platform that companies are building, where it's not just one indication, but there's multiple indications. We look at incredible teams. So Delix, when I think about from a platform perspective what is coming out of these new crop of drugs, it's that, oh, I could take this and I could go to work and I can function and I can actually connect with my team. Or I'm going through couples counseling, which is very painful.
Oh,
Nobody.
really?
I don't know anyone that likes couples counseling, by the way.
Oh, really? I love it.
Yeah,
It's like a good
Julie.
deep scraping of the gums.
But I envision some of these new chemical. Wow. Some of these new compounds, where imagine you're excited going into couples counseling. And because you're able to connect, and you're right, you're able to get to some of the deep-seated challenges where it's not, on November 10th, 2021, you did this, where you're not getting to that, but you're getting to the bigger picture. Hey, I really want to connect with you more. And I think that's where, when we think about regular life and what is possible, that's where I get excited, not just as an investor, but also as as someone who absolutely dives into this world.
I think something really interesting you said is like the phrase platform approach, because if you're thinking about a company that's like single target, single asset, single indication, that inevitably presents a binary risk profile, right? Like, let's say drug X is doing great, enters the clinic, there's cardiotoxic risks. How does that compound have an ability to iterate versus if you're able to think about different indications, if you're able to develop a number of different drugs in your pipeline, or thinking about the way to iterate, and perhaps the way to do that is by not having a single asset, but also by diversifying through a number of compounds, dosing schemes, indications, et cetera.
Anya, I do want to ask you one more question, which is just this idea of like a neuroscience startup. They have to balance the need for substantial funding with like a longer research timeline than they maybe used to. So like, are there any new investment models or partnerships that can help manage the kind of risk-reward assessment?
Great question. And I mean, when I
I just came up
Doing
with
my
that.
job.
when I think about life sciences, by the way, I started my career in life sciences, and then I left because I was working across a lot of different tech and innovation. Then came back in as an investor in a VC, and we have a fund in Europe, and the EU invited us to go into Europe and partner. And this is specifically in biotech and tech innovation. And they're matching our dollars, which is kind of shocking. And a lot of my VC friends are like, "How'd you guys do that?" But they're looking at ways to really, really just expand the ecosystem. And if you, how many people know how much it costs to take a drug to market? Okay, how much? Shout out numbers.
It's about $1.5 billion.
Yeah. More than anyone thinks, right?
Always more.
And so, exactly.
I think it's safe to say that it's more than MAPS thought it would be also.
A couple of decades ago. But, and when I look at this industry, it's really interesting because you had so many amazing people that came together to bring this industry kind of back into the forefront. It never really disappeared, by the way. And David Nichols, I think he's brilliant. If you don't know who David Nichols is, read about him. So we have a lot of incredible pioneers that kept research going, and continue doing these things. And then you have these companies that are coming out, and they're going to investors. And there's not a VC on the planet. Most of the first question they ask: Are you preclinical? Are you postclinical? I mean, where are you? And they know that they're just getting started. And so what you have to do is you have to go to family offices, all kinds of things. But I want to get all kinds of people where you're begging for money. They have no idea what you're talking about usually at all. And so the diligence process, it's interesting. And thank goodness we have groups like MAPS. We have groups like Hefner Institute that helped fund a number of the trials. And really brought a lot of that science that was happening for decades, and contributed to that. And so if you look at some of the publicly traded companies that are out there in psychedelics, they went public pretty early, and they have to keep fundraising, right? It's like, you go public because you hit you hit certain traction, and you have patents because that's how we value companies today, right? We're looking at patents. And I'm not going to get...
It's a whole separate panel.
Yeah, that's a can of worms we are not going to get into.
Yeah, and worth its own panel as our
It
panel.
really is. But the innovation about funding, crypto psychedelics, Matt, one of my partners, is over there. We talk about the crypto industry because, for some reason these guys knew something, right? But they were instrumental in helping fund some of these incredible foundations. And so there were a lot of groups and foundations. There's really exciting models that I love that has to do with investment communities that are jumping in. There's some cool things we're doing at Unity and the Imagine Fund that I'll talk about, maybe in a different panel. But there are incredible ways that there's a lot of innovation in how this industry actually got funded and where it's moving, and that's what I really love.
Are you doing a mentor, or are you doing a mentor? One of you are
I
doing
am.
Can you mention
Tomorrow.
when it is so people can come talk to you more?
Yes, I'm doing a mentorship for some.
It's like tomorrow?
It's tomorrow afternoon, but I think it's already booked up. But you can reach out to me.
Okay, I didn't know they had to
I'll
book.
give my
Never
email
mind,
address.
she's not available. You can't even get to her. Adrienne, I want to make sure that we feature you a little bit more. So I want you to sort of address this issue of how you prioritize therapeutic need versus commercial potential, and what factors sort of guide the decisions of I guess, where Palo Santo thinks it's making a good investment.
Yeah, so there's this really great interview in The Axial where they interviewed Mark Levin, who's the co-founder of Third Rock Ventures and Millennium Pharmaceuticals, and he kind of takes home this message where once you have the right team tackling on a particular disease, that it's key to have a well thought out plan to have the right drug for the right target, for the right patient, for the right time. And so just taking a step back in terms of what does a good team look like, I think that's a balance of scientific inquiry to do the proper due diligence of, is this scientifically robust? Is this rational? Is this testable? Is this hypothesis driven? Balancing that with the clinical expertise of what biomarkers to actually measure, having folks on the regulatory end to know what boxes need to be checked, because hype and excitement and cool, positive attitudes will not address the true bottlenecks at stake. It's people that understand the true limitations by having those early conversations with regulatory. And I think by having this well thought out team from a number of different angles throughout drug development, you're able to identify the key drug discovery benchmarks and translational assays to identify biomarkers that better substantiate a disease target. So I'll just take like Delix as an example here. So recently, again, they're targeting major depressive disorder, and clinical research has shown that the prefrontal cortex is dysregulated. Preclinical research has also shown that in animal models of depression, chronic stress leads to changes in the neuronal morphology, so the shape of these neurons, specifically through shorter dendrites, through less dendritic complexity, which is kind of the structure within a neuron that receives inputs from nearby neurons. And that stress leads to a decrease in this morphology. And so, for instance, Delix's recent presentation at the ACNP conference last November showed that their compound led to rapid, durable increases in dendritic length in rats, in the neurons of the prefrontal cortex that were being administered this drug. So I think this is a great example where you take a disease indication, you take a biomarker that's associated with it, and then you have translational assays that substantiate, we're going after major depressive disorder, look at what's happening in our ex vivo models that substantiate this, and I think it sets the stage for when they eventually do go into phase 2 testing, which will be in a cohort of patients with MDD. Currently, they are in phase 1, where they show that thus far, in phase 1 trials, their drug is healthy, well-tolerated, and there are not psychomimetic hallucinogenic effects. So I think that's key. I also think it's important to remember that science in and of itself is multiphasic. Success in one stage, whether that's preclinically or clinically, does not guarantee success in the subsequent stage, and that science inherently is iterative, where emerging data will always be used to evolve our hypotheses. So I think it's imperative to always question all assumptions, believe in the scientific method, as well as think about the key translational biomarkers at stake instead of not relying on hope and optimism to guide the way, because that's not going to make the FDA happy. It's real data.
So I don't know how wonky we want to get here. Actually, I'm going to ask the audience, are there, just by a show of hands, anybody who's got pressing questions? I want to know how much time to leave for Q&A. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, I'm not saying you can't, but like, given that, I want to quickly, who can summarize the most quickly digital phenotyping and why we should care? Divya.
Only because I do it on a daily basis. I measure brain waves.
Don't show off.
No, I'm just saying, this is my shtick, you know? I measure brain waves, and I find things about those brain waves, whether it's a pulse here or a band there or a crazy shape that these waves draw out. This is a biomarker. It's something that stands for something else. And what I found first in looking at people with reduced levels of consciousness is that I could create digital biomarkers from their brain waves that would tell me I can actually automate the tracking of states of consciousness now. And I'm moving this out to look for when brains break down. But the cool thing is that on many of these medicines, you will see these biomarkers, these shapes that the brain takes, move completely into an expansive state. And that is a really beautiful thing. And if you can show organizations like the FDA, or if you can show an investor that when someone is on one of these medicines, their brain goes from being contracted to really expanded by looking at the shapes that their brain waves take, we have a way now of actually here. And it doesn't, while looking at things like dendrites, well, those connections she was talking about, which is so true, that's an amazing thing to do, but it's very difficult to do this in a living brain. And so one of the really cool things about using brainwaves is that you can use an intact person who's having an experience with a living brain and actually come up with some of these biomarkers which validate.
And so practical implications are, number one, you can show something's working, but number two,
Regulation.
you may be able to predict who's going to be a good responder or a bad
Yes.
responder to this or that, and that will save everybody
That's
time and
called
money
a
and headache.
phenotype, but it basically just means my brain, your brain, your brain, we don't have the same
Right.
brains. We all respond differently to most things. It's actually a very interesting problem because all of medicine has been in generalized populations, and you take
Right.
some
Personalized
weird.
medicine is
This
not
is
not just
personalized.
that you, that
Yes.
you have a concierge doctor. No.
No,
The
it means that you can take
Right.
a biomarker that reflects who you are and
Right.
how you respond to that medicine, that
We can
intervention.
see what your liver enzymes are like, and it may turn out that you're a rapid metabolizer of ayahuasca. Who knew? Or it may be that you really don't metabolize MDMA very well, so your levels are higher, or you metabolize it so well that the metabolites build up because there's another missing step. So knowledge is power, and
Do you know that you
forewarned
can
is
scrape
forearmed.
like skin cells now and take fat cells from an adult, grow them up in a dish with factors, and create little mini brains? And all kinds of mini organs, or you can plate them on something that looks like a USB stick. And you can run some of these compounds through this from one person and see how they are going to respond.
Yeah,
And the world is crazy now.
For the field of psychiatry, it's incredibly, what we've always done in psychopharm is, as much as no one wants to admit it, it's a little bit like if you go get your eyes checked and they keep changing the lenses, and they're like, better like this, better like that, better like this, better like that, and they're working to find the right lenses. Well, in psychiatry, we kind of do that. We start you on a medicine. Is this good? Is this good? Is it better than you were? No. Okay. How about this medicine? Is this good? Do you feel better than you did? No. Okay, let's try the combination of these two, and maybe that'll work better. And it is really trial and error because we don't have the data ahead of time. But now more and more, there's genotyping, phenotyping, digital biomarkers. We're also going to be able to. There's something called BDNF that is kind of an okay measure of neuroplasticity and brain growth, and it was very early on. I was like, oh my God, we have to see if there's any BDNF involvement with MDMA, and lo and behold, there was, and it was very exciting. The world continues to be exciting. While you're lining up for Q&A, we're going to very quickly say what we're hopeful about. I have a long-standing interest in people with schizophrenia. I am delighted to report that there are 2 top researchers in the United States who are schizophrenia researchers, very well respected. One is on the East Coast, one is on the West Coast. It's a little bit of a Biggie, Tupac thing, except they're collaborating, they're not competing. It's Stephen Martyr at UCLA and John Kane in New York, and they're both going to be doing studies looking at whether MDMA may be helpful to people with schizophrenia. Not as a cure, but just maybe as 3 or 4 hours of respite where the paranoia and the fear comes down and people are open to maybe talking about their treatment or whether it's going well or not, or how their family's doing, but could be very helpful. We'll see. And if it's not, then we'll know it's not, and that can be the end of it. Hopes for the future, down the panel, quick Q&A.
Yeah, I think one of my main hopes is at the moment we understand what our true bottlenecks and limitations are that will be either current or in the future. So I know one that's of heavy conversation. Julie, I know you touched on it on your panel yesterday as well. We're at a stage where the demand is higher than the supply. So how will we scale these therapies, not only for MDMA, for PTSD, but if and when, MAPS has a number of ongoing studies, potentially for psychosis, potentially for eating disorders, potentially for a number of indications beyond just PTSD. How will this be scalable? And I also hope that there is this increased willingness to weather storms and hard times, and that potential failures, potential hard times are not downturns, but potentially opportunities to engineer solutions around them, as anything done differently involves challenging the dogma, and that hard times are viewed as opportunities to create solutions around them. And very quick, I hope that we have a balance of optimism, as positive attitudes is what paves the way forward, but that this is balanced with skepticism, with the scientific method, and questioning all assumptions. If it weren't for asking questions, we would still believe the world is flat. And so implementing the scientific method all throughout.
Very quickly, as a researcher who maps consciousness, the thing that became really clear to me is that the brain is actually a filter that kind of dumbs down the universe. And the thing that I find most exciting about these medicines, and that I also believe meditation does for us, is it reorients that filter to allow more information in, or a new way of perceiving information. And if that can give to people a new, I mean, we tell stories about ourselves. We come with they're so hardwired in us, and sometimes we don't break out to a new place because of these stories. If we can see the universe temporarily in a new way, we can actually change those stories we tell.
So for me, my hopes and future, I mean, look, we know that suffering's part of being human, right? That's, I guess, why we're here. That's what people say, but I think unnecessary suffering, that's what we're trying to really solve. That's my hope, is solving for unnecessary suffering. And so we have at the Imagine Fund over $1 billion that we've been developing out with our funds. And we're out front and center, really focused on mental health fitness for companies and creators. That's a big thing. But more importantly, helping get these incredible medicines from these amazing founders. I hope people who are investors are talking to the startups, but making sure those medicines get to as many people as possible in the billions.
So we should definitely take questions.
So
we're
yeah,
gonna get
we
kicked
can
out.
take questions and we can go along. Go ahead.
Oh, we can?
I'm Rex with CyberTalk TV, and I was able to screen a relevant documentary yesterday called Dark Night of Our Souls, where they follow 5 sufferers of PTSD, and psychedelics is one part of the treatment on that. But what they're finding is, along with spirituality and some other methodologies, that people become cured, or they end up experiencing what they're calling PTG, or post-stress growth, which is a positive reaction to these different types of therapy. Has there been any studies that the FDA or the drug companies are doing to follow people who are experiencing PTG as a result of these therapies?
Well, one of the things that MAPS has to do is follow up people who are in the MDMA PTSD study. And the follow-up actually shows that the numbers go up. People continue to improve. The durability is a real, one of your take-homes here is not just that it's fast, like way faster than antidepressants, but that there's real durability. But measuring what causes the growth or sustains the growth is an excellent thing to be looking at. Again, there's
Some of the digital biomarkers actually can help us with that, because you can do that in living brains. I really cannot emphasize enough. A lot of things that we had done in the past are in a dish, and you need to be able to extract nerve cells in a dish to do them. Digital biomarkers in these recordings we get actually are showing this continued growth. So there is a correlate to what you documented in your film.
Also, somebody asked at the very beginning about whether the patients know what we're doing, and God, yes.
Well, no, what she was talking about actually specifically the fact that I put leads on patients. Do they know that? And just for you in the back, it's one of the you guys don't know the stories about what an anesthesiologist has to do to know whether or not you're conscious. Having a brain monitor actually makes it much, much safer. And it enables me to look at your brain. We talked about how everybody's different. And I can literally dose the anesthetic to what your brain is asking for. There is a Goldilocks zone there, and I can give you drugs to match that special place you need to be. Not too light, not too deep. And then the side result is I can actually learn something about those underlying neural networks. So I'm actually using it to guide my clinic. Only about 2% of us do this. So
the bigger question of consent, certainly in clinical research, I would just like to assure you, is extremely thorough and well thought out.
Yeah.
And there are multiple steps of approvals and guidelines that have to be followed. Let's go with more questions.
First, thank you guys. Oh my gosh, I'm short. Thank you so much for being here. I've learned so much. This was incredibly valuable. This was more a question for Ani, being in the funding realm. We talked a little bit about having that focus be really placed upon the therapy component and that aspect of working with people in a continued state after the drug is administered. So how do you combat conversations in the funding realm that are focused on the drug itself, and how do you combat the focus if it ever shifts from the therapy, if that makes sense?
Oh, it does. There needs to be a much bigger panel about this. And, if you look at, because most of the drug companies, they have incredible people, like the people on this panel, that are advising and looking at what's the therapeutic advantages, what's the actual drug advantages. But we have a system right now, right, where we have to get guidance from the FDA. And the FDA is the one that's guiding how these different studies are structured. And so as investors are looking at both, right? And it's going to depend on the investor. I mean, you're going to have funds and investors that are all about what's the minimum amount of time, because people just want to take a pill and they want to go on with their day, right? And thank goodness there's also other investors from different realms that are saying, okay, what's the advantages of both? And I can talk about how I feel personally. I don't think there is a magic pill, and everyone will probably now shoot darts at me. I just don't. And maybe I'm wrong, right? Maybe I'm wrong. But I think that these medicines are so powerful that we don't need decades of suffering to get to where we become our very best. And that's what we're looking at investing in. I hope that helps.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you.
And to second that, thank you so much. I've learned a ton during this panel today. My name is Lindsay, and I was just curious, Divya and Adrian, more focused, I guess, towards you, but open to all. I know you mentioned stroke recovery with the aid of psychedelics, or kind of aid of those types of drugs. Have you seen some of these, or has anyone looked into kind of the spinal cord injuries, I guess, and the connections with the brain in that sense, with paralysis and everything
So
there?
I co-authored a review article about psychedelics and traumatic brain injury. So if you Google Julie Holland psychedelics brain injury, you'll see that, and it's a good review. But anyone else want to weigh in, please?
When you look at something like a spinal cord injury, right, what happens is when there is an injury to any level of the brain, things begin to retract in. And what these medicines can do is help these things move back out. I will say that this is part of a much larger field of stimulating brains that have undergone stroke, paralysis, brain damage for any reason, even infection. There are all kinds of ways now to non-invasively, which I mean you don't stick something in, like an electrode, into the brain, or you don't have to use stem cells or things like that, that you can actually get the brain to say, oh, I need to grow again. And these medicines are part of that. I also work a lot in extended reality, and virtual and extended reality are another non-invasive way of getting this to happen. And then the third way is we can non-invasively stimulate parts of the brain, like the vagus nerve or the motor cortex, or basically the part of the brain that's just underneath the forehead. And we have all kinds of indications, biomarkers and tests that have shown that there is regrowth. There's a beautiful foundation called the Walk Again Foundation that has actually shown that if you train somebody in a harness, you record their brain waves if they're paralyzed from the waist down, you record their brain waves and send the decoding information to a bionic exoskeleton which carries their legs forward. Then you have them wear a vest which gives them haptic feedback every time their feet move. And then you have them also train in VR and watch their feet doing this. Without anything else, they will regrow connections, and many of them have actually regained neurological function without any surgery, anything else.
And without any psychedelics. Now imagine adding plasticogens
adding that
as a catalyst.
Because your brain is even more plastic. It can take in more information, form these new connections, and it has this sort of chemical impetus to grow again and to make it. It's an explosive field.
Well, and I just one other thing, just very quickly, when you look at what's happening, I have a couple of family members that have had some significant injuries in that way. And so if you look at the regenerative medicine industry, and I keep thinking, so I'm now making some introductions with our friends there, and the psychedelic industry. Yeah. I mean, God, I just, I get very excited about that.
It's an explosion.
Yeah.
Yeah. The Walk Again Foundation, yeah.
Yeah,
it's one of many. It's not the only one, but they have great videos on YouTube.
Lots of synergy between health and tech and psychedelics that's going to come together more and more.
Yeah.
It's really an amazing time to be a psychiatrist. I also, Ani, those statistics of 1 in 4, 1 in 3, 1 in 2, and I'm like, it's a good time to be a psychiatrist. Like there's tremendous need, there's tremendous suffering, and we have new tools, finally, because we've been working with the same shit since the 80s. So it is a good time to be in the field of mental health.
Just this last fall, we worked on a loneliness prize.
Great. We have time for one more question, and we'll also hang out here if you want to chat. So go right ahead.
Hi guys, thanks for this panel. Used to be hyperactive as a kid, dyslexic massively, so, kind of, I suppose drugs kind of helped me understand my brain better. Interesting conversation with my parents, which are older, a couple of weeks ago, what are you going to do with this when we're older? And I was like, I'll put you all on CBD, to be honest. But I think this is a growing issue in the world. Everybody's getting older.
Yeah.
And how can we help?
I'm definitely gonna take that. So remember when I said that psychedelics are anti-inflammatory and they're immune modulating? There is growing anecdotal data, no question, that older people are microdosing, macrodosing. I've heard amazing stories here and at other conferences. I've seen pictures. Amanda Fielding from Beckley Foundation, she's outside of Oxford in the UK. She promised Albert Hofmann that she would dedicate her time to researching LSD and cognitive sort of enhancement. She's got studies where people with Alzheimer's are microdosing LSD. She's showing me pictures of, these older people who've just kind of look glazed over and they're not focused. And then she's like, and this is the picture on 10 micrograms. And you can see the light back in their eyes. Stories, we heard a story yesterday when I was on a panel. This guy said, that he was giving his mother, grandmother, somebody with Alzheimer's, psilocybin mushrooms and also LSD. And the change was just completely marked, that she went from not recognizing him to recognizing him. That she went from sitting around staring at the walls to singing and dancing in the kitchen, just marked change. So this is going to be a booming industry. And again, this issue of plasticogens that don't induce hallucinations, whatever you want to make of those words, but this idea that you can take advantage of the neuroplasticity and the anti-inflammatory properties, which are significant, and some compounds more than other, including DOI, which is under risk of being made Schedule I, which would be terrible for researchers. We're going to see booming. And there are already people dosing their mothers and grandmothers, and not just CBD. So CBD is also a neuroplasticogen. I can't believe how many times I'm saying this word. The cannabinoids, being under the umbrella of psychedelics, as they are, the cannabinoids are also, they enable neuroplasticity. And I can't think of too many herbal medicines, honestly, safer for an adult or aged adult to use than just plain old cannabis, whether it is smoked or whether you're taking CBD ointment for your arthritis or oral. Before I was, I've always been very passionate about psychedelics and a psychonaut, but also very passionate about cannabis as a medicine. My first book, Ecstasy, The Complete Guide, my second book was called The Pot Book, all about cannabis as a medicine. So under this umbrella, cannabis is a psychedelic that enables neuroplasticity that can be helpful for older folks, and so can psychedelics.
This is a Beyond MDMA panel, so I'm going to do a little beyond. Music and dancing have been shown to be so extraordinarily helpful for people as they age. There are people who are catatonic who have been brought back to life, literally, but it also, especially dance, because there's a motor aspect, there's a social aspect, there's the music, which is actually like mathematical sequencing. It engages so many parallel pathways in your brain that it actually also helps with plasticity and growth. I am going to throw in there the meditation. I have started throwing my parents into VR. They're having incredible, so there is a whole host of ways to begin to re-stimulate our brains and to preserve them. And I'm not even putting my company here, but I work on a problem called delirium, which is brains in older people breaking down. And I'm looking to catch it early so we can treat that. If your brain breaks down and we don't catch it in the hospital, the chance that you will get dementia goes up 13-fold. And so one way to protect aging brains is to make sure they don't break down in the first place. So
You guys, I just had this crazy idea. Sit with me for a minute, but like, what if we combined like music and dancing with psychedelics? I'm just spitballing, but
That's
like,
crazy,
can you
Julie.
imagine
That's
like
crazy talk.
what that experience would be? Ani, did you want the last word?
Yeah, I flew in here from the Beneficial AGI Summit down in Panama, and I get to work with people like Ben Goertzel, who's like, he's a legend and kind of an early pioneer of AGI, but also helped create Sophia the robot with David Hansen, and there's a lot happening. Most of the robot people, I think they all got together and realized, okay, elderly people really need some help. And so that's kind of been the big thing. They all talk about this. And just anecdotally, I mentioned earlier my mom's in stage 6 Alzheimer's, which has been like, she's like my rock star, and I love her to just beyond belief. And she always resisted tech. Always. She's this older Indian woman. She's like, nah, I don't want that. Just call me on the digital, analog phone. And as she's progressed, we actually we've been using technology to help her, and she loves Amazon's little Astro robot. We got to early test, and so it's been amazing, just the interaction, and she's almost like childlike joy with Alexa and just simple things where she can speak and she's getting that responsiveness and music and all kinds of things that's really surprised us. So yeah, it's really exciting when you think about, as we all age, what's going to be happening.
keep
and our
older brains
parents and
stimulated.
grandparents.
Don't
Yeah.
isolate them.
Absolutely.
Isolation is a form
Yeah.
of torture.
I think that's what
Yeah.
I'm more worried about.
Yes.
Kind of preparing towards, as they get older, kind of thing. But
Yeah.
thanks a lot.
Give them a lot of love.
Isolation
And
is a form
psychedelics.
of
I'm just
torture. Thanks everybody for coming.